editorial board headed by Brittany Myberg. Please check it out. Now over to Dr. Ong.
Well, thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here. I was just speaking with Shanur right before we started and sharing with her my experience as a journal editor as well. And I think it's so important for journals to be continuing its program and project of inclusion, cultivating scholarship, and facilitating interdisciplinary and lively discussions around very important and urgent issues. So thank you so much for inviting me. It's an honor to meet with you and your community in the University of Toronto virtually. So I think that your journal is actually in a very unique position in the academy to be talking about issues focused on the Global South, certainly in comparative context. And I think that makes you so much more attuned to how issues of inequality, crisis, and disaster are differentially experienced, and also how new forms of solidarity, care, and resistance might emerge in very unexpected spaces. And I think as a scholar who has previously studied disasters in the Philippines, but also in comparative context, in humanitarian crises, it's important to look at both issues of exploitation, and inequality and how that's exacerbated, but also attune and take time as well to focus on those issues of coping, community, and care for each other. And I think that we can have that discussion today. So one more thing about your journal, and I hope that my talk today can also discuss, will be to think through how a numbers-based storytelling of the pandemic, which is a kind of like dominant mode of representation of the pandemic, would render invisible, right? Like so many other kinds of stories. And I think the previous speaker and the previous keynote speaker, Professor Tungohan, had discussed, right, like migrants and documented workers, workers in informal economies, right, like how they're set apart from official representation. And I want to advance some of that discussion today. Certainly one that is approached with nuance and different kinds of perspective about both the extent of the crisis in the global south, the extent of the crisis as experienced by marginalized populations, but in some cases also how the success stories of how certain countries in the global south have actually survived the pandemic, right? But they're not really talked about in in any kind of depth by global media. And I think that hurts not just scientific knowledge, but also intercultural, or one might call it cosmopolitan exchange and knowledge. So I want us to talk about those kinds of positive experiences and stories as well. So the title of my talk is Mitigating the Contagion of Stigmatization, Racism, and Discrimination in the Infodemic Moment. So just as a background, most of my talk will draw from a forthcoming review that I'm writing for the Social Science Research Council in the US, where they've commissioned me to do a review of the infodemic that accompanied the pandemic. So that forthcoming paper will pay attention to the interrelationships between conspiracy theory and disinformation on one hand, hate speech and racist speech, and those porous boundaries between them, right? And also the emerging challenges of government regulation and censorship that are consequences of attempts to mitigate the infodemic. So, right, like those are the regulatory impulses, like to answer the infodemic, but perhaps they're exacerbating and creating new problems. So, the argument that I make in this paper for the SSRC is that we need to understand the infodemic as a crisis of communication in two ways. First, there is a failure to communicate correct scientific facts that would promote public health. But the secondary failure is that it's a moral failure in cultivating cosmopolitan imagination, empathy, and solidarity. And we need to understand both kinds of dynamics. We can shine a spotlight certainly on politicians and platforms and how they have not done enough to promote healthy behaviors of mask wearing or taking down claims of miracle cures. But we also need to acknowledge, reckon with cultural biases in journalistic reporting, in official speech that have often reinforced racial prejudice and racial hierarchies and contributed to the discrimination of certain communities. So, one aspect of my talk today will discuss processes of othering and how those are common but also differently experienced across cultural contexts. So, can we understand and critique, for example, anti-Asian, anti-Chinese racism in Euro-American contexts, but also understand their specific power dynamics within Asian countries as well? Where anti-China political speech in recent years in some Southeast Asian countries that I've looked at, particularly Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand, it's regarded as activist communication. It's justified as a weapon of the weak, speaking out against global power. So I think it's important to recognize those kinds of slippery slopes. Um, I'll also be reviewing other scholars and how they've discussed moral justifications around um, statements such as, how can I be racist when I'm Asian myself, when I'm Chinese myself? So you can't use that label to me. Or even as a platform worker or a fact checker who might say, my job here is to fact check false claims. I'm not here to call out racist speech, which I've heard a lot from certain platforms and journalists whom I've worked with in Southeast Asia. So for this keynote, that's the central topic, and I'll be drawing more from that. But I'll begin with a more theoretical discussion. I know that a lot of you are not from media studies, and I want to also kind of give you a flavor of how we theorize mediated experience and how we think media and technologies shape how we regard the public world, how we engage the public world through our devices and screens and interfaces. So I'll begin with something a bit more theoretical, and that will be the first part of my talk. I'll then move on to racism and discrimination in its different forms across different countries. And then I'll end with more of an exchange about how we might think about academic practice and the role of researchers in community building, solidarity, and allyship in the pandemic moment. And I'd love for us to have more questions around that. So first, around the theories that I'm thinking about. So for those of you in media studies or media sociology, you might be familiar with the concept of witnessing. And this is a concept used to think through ethical questions about media representation of crisis, suffering, and disaster. And what are the responsibilities of the witness? What are the responsibilities of the media producer, the journalist, or audiences at home who are viewing and engaging with the public world through screens and interfaces? So the work of Lily Kolyaraki would say that any kind of news report, for example, is an invitation for audiences to take up or reject a moral responsibility to engage with what's happening on screen. So audiences at home are oriented or not to care for suffering others on screen. And sometimes they are represented with some invitation toward empathy, and other times there's none. And audiences have moral responsibility and capacity to choose among whether to care or be apathetic or even respond with disgust or denial toward what's happening on screen. So what are the conditions of pandemic witnessing? And here I'll outline my personal observations of pandemic witnessing and how certain kinds of technological features had shaped our collective sense making and engagement with what's going on in the world nowadays. So one key feature of pandemic witnessing, I would say, is magnification. Magnification. So this is a combination of the experience of many of us, not most of us, some of us who are privileged to be working at home or stuck at home and perhaps glued to our screens and interfaces of media and technology. And we've become kind of forensically focused with what's going on in the news, with what's going on in our social media feeds. So we're making sense of word and image, and trying to make the strange new world, the scary new world, more knowable, more manageable. And there's a kind of detective quality to this kind of witnessing where, and one might think about the aunties or uncles in our family who have suddenly become expert epidemiologists, right? Like recommending best cures or safety measures, how to go about surviving, shopping in the grocery, right? And there's new cycles of facts, rumors, debunking new information, that, and also another aspect of battling trolls, battling bots, reporting racist speech, coordinating behaviors to kind of like hijack certain hashtags or torpedo certain hashtags. So that's something that we've now become more accustomed to. It's something we can do from our home. And I like this. So the word magnification for me resonates with how I just noticed a lot of journalistic writing now uses words that pertain to hyper visibility. So the most common phrase, and I see that in our how the keynote was discussed, right? I mean, this workshop was written about. The pandemic has laid bare, or the pandemic has brought attention, or invisible systems of inequality have become visible. So for me, like in the pandemic's reorganization of ordinary life, where everything has become uncanny, our tools of witnessing, media witnessing, have magnified and laid bare what was existing all along, but perhaps hiding in plain sight, or we've become just too ignorant to pay attention to that. So that's the first feature. The second feature is about witnessing from parallel lives. That there's no one modality of witnessing anymore. So in the past, when we think about the media witness, we often imagine a white middle-class person engaging with the public world through the television, where this person has a sense of ontological security, safety, right? But now that notion of ontological security, we've come to acknowledge that as something so unequal. It's always been unequal, but now it's just so much more obvious. So there's a combination here about socioeconomic inequalities, and we've become more aware of that, but also of polarized politics. That we've kind of become more aware about how our information ecosystems exist in like parallel universes, right? Like the Trump supporter consumes a whole different kind of news ecosystem with a different kind of lens and explanatory framework that is just completely dissonant from our own, and it's almost impossible to engage. And I find that very concerning. And of course, we've seen that play out in the US election, and we will continue to see those repercussions. In more ordinary settings, like on social media, like I would also look at the Instagram stories of my friends in Japan and Korea, and it seems like they're living a whole kind of parallel universe. They're out in the clubs, they're out drinking, like things are normal, quote unquote, right? Well, here I am in Massachusetts. I think we might go to another lockdown. We're worried about Thanksgiving plans being put into disarray. So this sense of like we are witnessing each other across like huge, huge divides. And a final feature of pandemic witnessing, I would say, is an acute sense of media and technological reflexivity, where we've developed a high degree of skepticism and distrust toward official media narratives and also big platforms, big tech, where now it's commonplace for ordinary people to have discussions around norms of right and wrong or regulation of social media, right? Like ordinary people kind of have a sense that Facebook should be regulated somewhat. So this could be driven by political opportunism or a desire to control speech, perhaps by politicians who might benefit from a moral panics around fake news or the infodemic. Or it could be a critical attentiveness to how people of color or sexual minorities are becoming targets of disinformation or hate speech or fake news. And I think there's new research around these themes, which are great. But we've all kind of come to some agreement that social media, official media, are platforms that we should be skeptical about. They should be regulated in some way. And we need to make sure, however, that any kind of cure we propose is not worse than the illness of the infodemic. And we need to guard against regulation that would do more damage to civic exchange and political deliberation. So let me know what you think about that whole metaphor of pandemic witnessing, whether you think that resonates with you. I'm inspired certainly by visual metaphors of visibility. Arundhati Roy has written about pandemic as a portal. It opens up a new way of seeing, right? A new way of experiencing the world. And I'm thinking about how it will have long-term repercussions on how we theorize about media and technology. So that's Act 1 of my talk. I'll now move on to Act 2, which is around racism and stigmatization. So in Euro-American context, I think we've become aware about the rise of physical assault, but also racial slurs hurled toward people of East Asian descent, accusing their culture of causing the disease. Within different Asian countries as well, anti-Chinese sentiment has also surged, where neighboring countries of China and the resentments towards Beijing's territorial encroachments have been displaced also onto mainland Chinese immigrants or tourists who have come to be accused as virus carriers or political spies. Beyond these egregious incidents of racism against East Asians in general, or mainland Chinese in particular, other targets of COVID-19 discrimination and profiling include many different groups. In the US, Black and Latinx people have obviously been disproportionately affected by the virus by virtue of their professional and economic comorbidities. They are also targets of insidious media manipulators, such as when white supremacists circulated conspiracy theories that Black people could not contract the virus in the work of Brandy Collins Dexter. Many national governments have seized emergency powers to silence critics, invade privacy, curb civil liberties, sometimes targeting the whistleblowers, such as in mainland China, or even the frontline health workers in Thailand, who are talking about they need medical equipment. And they've been targeted by Thai laws around social media speech. But in different communities, it's either economic migrants, sexual minorities, religious minorities have been targeted by various kinds of efforts to supposedly mitigate the infodemic. But we also need to attend to how news media outlets have occasionally reproduced stereotypical frames in their reportage. Think about the stark difference in the way developed countries in the West are often praised for their preparedness, while poorer non-Western countries are accorded less visibility and agency. In cases when poorer countries are cited for having low death rates, journalists speculate on exotic explanations of possible blood immunity. Think about how African countries or India, at some point early on in COVID-19, when journalists were puzzled, how come there's low death rates here? And it's very exotic explanations that are marshaled. I'm also thinking about those memes of the heroes of the world leaders who have stood up against COVID-19 very well, and they're mostly female, and it's always white women leaders. They forget the Taiwanese prime minister, who have obviously marshaled an incredible pandemic response. And she's absent from those memes early on. And then she was like inserted at some point. But it's important to note, so now I did a review of like early writings in the pandemic back in March and April. Um, Many scholars at that time, some of them were actually quite optimistic. So the publication Politico online brought together a range of scholars from different fields to sketch out their pandemic predictions. And some had envisioned potential for cosmopolitan solidarity to emerge out of this shared experience of crisis. There was Peter Coleman who said that the pandemic could be that formidable enemy that might provide us with a fusion-like energy and a singularity of purpose to help us reset and regroup. Another scholar, Tom Nichols, envisioned a return to faith in serious experts, a new seriousness. I like him a lot. Yuval Noah Harari also wrote for Foreign Affairs. He said that he was rallying for a new spirit of global cooperation and trust, which could involve countries exchanging information openly, humbly seeking advice, sharing rather than hoarding medical equipment or vaccine. And instead, what we have found, right, is that governments militarized pandemic responses, journalists and stereotypical media representations, unaccountable technological interventions have only reinforced a very cruel biopolitics. Some human lives or deaths are accorded more visibility or grievability than others. So there's some aspects of this kind of movement, right, which is part of, one might say, like natural human instinct of trying to create like explanatory frames to manage what is something fearful, right? Like there's been a long history about finding scapegoats, especially around public health crises. But there's also in our digital environments more systematic, deliberate manipulation where certain kinds of bad actors, they could be governments, they could be white supremacist groups, they could be particular kinds of political parties who might want to exploit the crisis and stoke social divisions in order to gain more power. So the work of Neil Johnson and colleagues have used social network analysis, in their words, to map out a vast hate multiverse where politicians, governments, influence operators, trolls exploit COVID-19 to spread racism and other malicious agenda. And it's not just the usual suspects. The sociologist Joan Donovan, based in Harvard, my colleague this semester, has astutely spotlighted how social media have sometimes connected odd bedfellows around hateful speech and conspiracy theory. And she was drawing a link between US-based white supremacists connecting with pro-democracy activists in Asia who were commonly sharing racist speech against the WHO Director General, who is of African descent. And I think this is a promising and emerging area of research, and we need to have more studies here that can track the unexpected ways in which hate speech is amplified, repurposed, and morally justified across diverse national contexts. So I'll try to move on to, like, in the last 5 minutes. I'll try to wrap up in 5-6 minutes, just to review some contributions of different kinds of disciplines that I've drawn upon in that review, including history and area studies, also social linguistics, and finally media studies around this area of mediated racism. So I look to scholars in history and area studies. Frank Yu, Jennifer Ho have done great work to discuss in the US and specifically the historical precedents around the discourse of yellow peril in how we need to understand COVID-19 discrimination from that historical lineage, such that COVID-19 discrimination landed on fertile historical ground, right? So these kinds of exclusionary speech and aggressive speech had been very much entrenched in US history, where the yellow peril frame, in the words of Jennifer Ho, had once associated Chinese working class immigrants with disease and dirt. And we see that how cultural practices such as eating bat soup or other exotic wildlife, right, have had also been projected, even though there's disinformation around this. Like those were repurposed videos that we had seen. Asian studies scholar Linda Hasunuma had remarked, we all became Chinese in the minds of some Americans who kept seeing and sharing COVID-linked sensational images and stories of Chinese people's strange and exotic culinary preferences in their wet markets. But I think there's been a great movement around area studies, history scholars who are trying to contribute to this discussion, and also in the wake of racial justice movements in May and June to engage with that, right? And there's very intersectional solidarity that is present here as well. I'm thinking about the powerful global movement that mobilized early on around the hashtag hate is a virus to creatively and collectively speak out against crimes against people of Asian descent. Later on, like certain those hashtags had also expressed solidarity in relation to Black Lives Matter. I'm thinking of hashtag Yellow Peril supports Black Lives. I'm thinking of many Instagram accounts of Asians for Black Lives, Asian for Black Lives Matter, and other kinds of Facebook groups that such as subtle Asian traits. Some of you might know it, like this is a close Facebook group for people of Asian descent, many of them from the diaspora. It's usually about sharing jokes and memes about cultural upbringing, and then it became much more pointed towards activists and also fundraising initiatives around racial justice and racism and calling out racism. I want to give a shout out to some work, for example, in sociolinguistics. Carmen Lee, I believe she's at CUHK in Hong Kong. She analyzed hashtags and rhetorical techniques of racism. So she discussed like different kinds of techniques of naming, such as hashtag China virus, metaphors, hashtag Chinese is virus, blaming, hashtag China lied, people died, or dehumanization, hashtag locust, and how those are used to mobilize certain kinds of racist aggressions online. She might be here now, but she's certainly presenting after me. Gabrielle Lim, also in Harvard's Technology and Social Change Project. So we're hoping to study, right, Gabby, about how coordinative strategies and social networks on Twitter mobilize around certain kinds of hashtags, such as hashtag ChinaZi, hashtag WuhanNazi. Like where are the key nodes? We're interested to figure out more around that. We don't have the data yet, but this is we're starting to scrape Twitter data around this, and who might be the key amplifiers of some of these hashtags. Within Asia, these kinds of discrimination have also happened. One can think about intra-ethnic hostilities in Hong Kong between Hong Kongers and mainland Chinese, where over the years, this mockery of mainlanders with the slur locust had steadily played out against a battle for political sovereignty from Beijing. And usually there's a justification here as, this is not racism. How can I be racist when we're the same race, right? And so ways of deflecting this claim of racism. In the Philippines and Indonesia, burdened by China's recent territorial encroachments in the South China Sea, these kinds of expressions of anti-Chinese speech are used as a weapon of the weak, right? In COVID times where hate speech and disinformation have converged, activists and some journalists also became complicit in amplifying anti-China conspiracy theory, thinking about the Wuhan laboratories as the origin point of the virus. And sometimes, like when I would engage in academic, journalist, multi stakeholder interfaces, it's like, are you doing something here around fact checking this? There's sometimes justifications here where journalists and fact checkers have said, oh, I'm here to fact check falsehoods. I'm not here to take down hate speech. And I think that it's important to be equally attuned here to those kinds of expressions. Um, I think there's very promising strand of research looking at how certain kinds of ethnic minorities and marginalized groups are being targeted by disinformation. So Brandy Collins Dexter has looked at how Black communities in the US were targets of health misinformation and disinformation. And although this is not COVID related, but in the time of the US elections, certain kinds of extremist messaging were trying to sow divisiveness among Black people and Asian American communities, where Black protesters were being depicted as looters. So for those of you who might be familiar with a meme called Rooftop Koreans, myself and some colleagues have talked about how there's been a deliberate aim to sow distrust and discord among different kinds of ethnic minorities in the US, and usually for political kinds of motives. So one huge gap that I just want to focus on before we open for question time is how can researchers provide guidance to government regulators who are all too eager to introduce measures to mitigate the infodemic, to curb fake news, to curb the fear of the virus, right? So what might be incentives? How could we incentivize people to provide soft touch regulation such that it won't curb on people's ability to engage and participate and express dissent, right? While at the same time also be deplatforming and taking out paying attention to slurs, jokes, propaganda, and they're very fine, the fine lines that separate those between intentional disinformation and some kinds of rumors or racist speech, right? Those delineations are very, very porous sometimes. So, so that ends the part two. I just want to end with also, since this is a community of scholars from different backgrounds and disciplines, I want to know about how you and your communities in different kinds of areas, whether it be in area studies, whether it be in studies of the Global South or migration studies or media studies, how is this new awareness of inequalities laid bare and hyper reflexivity about the technologies we use? How has that changed different kinds of research agendas? How are scholars attending to inequalities within their own workplaces and their own communities of scholarship, right? And how are they also studying that among the communities that they're working with? How has research kind of accelerated this need, for engaged scholarship that even though it's very risky sometimes, scholars are usually like wanting to move things at a slow pace and a very careful pace. But we also are being called more and more to intervene quickly on fast moving issues. So what might be ways in which we can support each other around those kinds of movements and an intention to do good and to help our community? So I'll end there and would love to entertain questions.